Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me for today's devotion. We are in Exodus chapter 7, whether you're watching on video or listening to the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a difficult subject. It's the fact that Pharaoh's heart was hardened and who hardened his heart. Let's read in chapter 7 some verses, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. In chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, God is speaking to Moses and says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my host, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments." And of course, God would send the plagues to do that. In verses 12 and following, the Bible says, "For each one of them threw down his staff, and they turned into serpents." This was after Aaron had thrown down Moses' staff, and it turned into a serpent. The magicians of Egypt, empowered by Satan, if you will, did the same. But then it says in verse 12 that Aaron's staff swallowed up their staff. So Aaron's snake, God's snake, swallowed up the magician's snakes, if you will. Verse 13, "Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said." And then also in chapter 7, verses 21 and following, the Bible says, the fish, this is when God turned the water of the Nile River to blood, says the fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, it smelled, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile River. And the blood was through all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart, notice this, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, didn't listen to Moses, as the Lord had said. God said this is what he was going to do. So the question is, did God force Pharaoh to say no, to disobey God, to not listen to Moses and Aaron? Did God harden his heart? Well, those that in theology we refer to as Calvinists, those of a Reformed theology, would say, yes, God did this. God hardened his heart. God is the reason that he said no, that it appears like man has a choice, but he really doesn't, that everything is determined by God, but man is still responsible for it. Well, I'm not a Calvinist, never have been, never will be. And for me, their position, in my opinion, distorts the biblical evidence. I think sometimes what happens is some people take a minority of verses and use those to interpret what a majority of verses say. And I think the better approach is for the majority of verses that say something to help us understand what a minority of verses say. To me, that just makes a lot more sense, and that's the case when it comes to the hardening of heart and other things. In Exodus 7, it is pictured as, very clearly, Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and a couple of times that God is the one doing it. But it's also true that more times in Exodus is pictured as Pharaoh hardening his own heart. For example, in chapter 8, which we'll look at tomorrow, in verse 15, the Bible says, "But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, when God had removed one of the plagues from the land, I think it was the frogs, that he hardened his heart." Pharaoh hardened his own heart and did not listen to them, did not listen to Moses and to Aaron. Also in that same chapter 32, after another plague, the flies and so on, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And this time also, again, there, Pharaoh did it. Now, what you're going to see in the book of Exodus is sometimes it just says his heart is hardened. Other times God hardened his heart, and other times that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So what's going on? Let me illustrate it this way. Some of you have had a teenager, and if you haven't, you've seen others, who was in a period of rebellion, making bad decisions, disobeying, doing what's wrong, getting into trouble. And no matter how much the parents tried to help, tried to correct, tried to confront, tried to teach, tried to guide, the teenager just got worse. And they blamed their parents. Every time they did something wrong, they blamed their parents. As their heart got harder, the rebellion got worse. They became more defiant. Who's to blame? the parent for trying to teach, for saying, for correcting, for punishing, or the teenager who is disobeying? Well, I think it's the teenager, and I think it's the same with human beings. God speaks to us, but our response determines what happens in our heart. In verse 14 of Exodus 7, the Bible says that God told Moses that Pharaoh's heart is stubborn and he refuses to listen, refuses to obey. And it's that consistent refusal to listen and obey that hardened his heart, just like with a rebellious teenager. Verse 13 in that same passage said that Pharaoh did not listen to them, and the Lord had said, God knows what you're going to do before you ever do it. Now listen, because God knows something does not mean God determines something. There's a difference in knowing and determining. So God knew Pharaoh's heart and how he would respond. And no matter what God did or what God said, Pharaoh was going to respond with no, and his heart was going to get harder and harder. And God was speaking to him through Moses, through the circumstances, through the plagues. Each time Pharaoh said no, each time his heart became more like rock, more like stone. What did God do in all of this? Here's what God was doing. He was forcing Pharaoh to hit rock bottom so he would eventually obey, so he would eventually do what is right. God told Moses in Exodus chapter 5, before he ever sent him to Egypt, that the only way Pharaoh would obey and let the people go would be under compulsion. You could say in one sense, it's like God was doing his own intervention with Pharaoh to get him to hit rock bottom so he would do what was right, even if it was under compulsion. And in the end, that's what happened, and God was glorified, and the Hebrew people were freed. How you and I respond to God, to what he says, to what he does, shapes our heart, shapes our life, shapes our relationships, not only with family and friends, but with Jesus himself. So if you want your heart to be soft, just keep obeying Jesus. If you want your spiritual heart to get hard, just keep disobeying God, because your response will determine what happens to your heart. Hey, God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at the next chapter.